Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be going over how to make a medium size rose, maybe medium small size rose. So I'm going to be going over how I thin my petals out, what cutters I'm using, and how to make a bud. So I'm going to start with how to make a bud first. So I have here an 18 gauge wire. You can also use 20 gauge. So I'm just going to make a hook on the end. And then I'm just going to take some paste, and you can either have your paste matching your petals, or you can have just white. It really doesn't matter. I'm going to start with a ball. So you want to put some pressure on that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a teardrop. So I'm just taking my end of my hand and thinning one side out. And it doesn't have to really be pretty. It's going to be underneath all this gum paste anyway. So I'm just going to insert the end with the hook inside. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pinch halfway. So I'm taking all that excess off because I don't necessarily want all that gum paste on there. And then I just twisted. So it's not the prettiest bud, but it will do. You can reshape in it once it's on the hook. And there you have a bud. I would let this sit for a good 3-4 days before you even start working with it, because what you'll find is if it's not dry, it's going to pop right off, and usually that happens when you have all your petals on top. So, and you really don't want that. So that's what I suggest is 3 to 4 days for drying time. So we're going to start with some pink gum paste. I've already conditioned this with some Crisco. Just remember when you're working with gum paste to always keep it covered really nice and well with saran wrap, because the stuff dries out really fast. It's got a lot of Tylose powder, which is the drying agent, and it dries out faster than fondant ever does. So that's, just be aware of that. And this is the bud we're going to start with. And this has been drying for, I don't know, actually a couple months I've had this. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare my cutters. Now you can use whatever cutter you want. I've got these metal cutters, which are really nice. I think I got these off of Amazon, and I can make a list for you. I also have these cutters, which I use a lot, and there's actually a smaller one. This is a larger set, but I'm just focusing on these 3, and this has another piece to it. This is by FMM, and I think, and this is just a flower set that I bought off of Amazon. And then I'll also be using a Veinner, silicone Veinner. I got this off of Amazon. It's really nice. It's one of my favorites. So what you want to do is you're going to compare your bud with the size of your cutter. So I think this is a pretty good size. You want to have enough space to cover the tip of that bud. I wouldn't want anything smaller than this. I think this would be too small. So with the FMM cutters, I would go with this size. So this would be kind of like the medium size. So, and then I will talk about graduating to a larger size cutter once we get the initial row started. So I'm just going to go with this one here. And when I start with a regular plastic bag. This is from Target. I cut the side off and the bottom off, and what I do is I have the amount of petals I need in here. And you can have a lot of petals and have them just in several bags, just waiting. If you are worried they're going to dry out, you can always lay a damp rag on top of your bag. So what I do is I start with 4 petals, and then I graduate to 3, and then another 3 and another 3. So that's 3 sets of 3, and then I graduate to a set of 5, and then another set of 5. So that pretty much consists of this rose here. There might be a little variations in the center, but I'm pretty sure that this is what I started with. So I'm going to show you how I go about thinning out my petals. You want your gum paste pretty thin. So I'm just going to start with a small chunk. Seal the top. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to thin out the edge here. I'm just focusing on the edge. I want to have some thickness here at the bottom of your petal so that it holds up and it has some stability. If it's completely thin, it'll just flop over and it'll end up becoming kind of a mess. So what I do is I'm just taking my finger and just thinning out the edge on each one. Okay, so this is how I get a nice delicate petal. If you feel that this is too rough on your fingers, you can always take your thumb and press it down at first. Remember, the thicker your initial gum paste that you roll out, the harder it's going to be to thin out with your fingers. it's going to be really rough on your hands because you have to get that piece to really flatten out. Okay, so that's how I start thinning them out. Okay. So now we're going to go back to where we started. And then what I do is I take out first what I need. And it's pretty thin, as you can see. That edge, pretty thin. So then what I like to do is I just like to thin them out just a little bit more. I kind of pull at them. If you find that it tears, it's really no big deal. In fact, it kind of adds to the rose. Rose petals are certainly not perfect. And it gives it more life. Okay, so then I'm going to take each one and press down. And I try to get them in the center. If they don't, it's no big deal. Sometimes I'll put 2 or 3 at a time if they fit. As you can see here, I'm putting 2. Just for time purposes. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my water pen and I'm going to wet my bulb or my bud. And then I'm just going to place the bud in the middle of the petal and just take and wrap that petal around. So you end up getting a cone. And you do not want to see the white of your bud where you started. That should be completely closed right there. And then what I'm going to do from there is I'm just wetting kind of in a V shape, I guess, on each petal. And I don't want to oversaturate. If you find that you oversaturate your petal, just let it sit for 5 minutes or so to kind of let that water dry a little. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to place this seam on top of the first petal. And then I'm going to wrap the right side around that cone, and then I'm leaving this part open. So then I'm going to tuck this guy here inside of the first petal. And then I'm going to take the first petal and close that. So right now I have the second petal just hanging there. And it's wet enough where it's not going to flop, it's not going to go anywhere. I'm going to take the third petal and I'm going to cover the seam of the first petal. So you've got 3 petals. I'm going to close this guy up, and then the second petal I'm going to close up. So you've got 3 petals 1, 2, 3. And then I'm going to pinch at the bottom. And I'm going to twist. Now you can also cut these with a small little scissors if you want, but I'm just going to twist. And then there's the excess. You can save it or not. And I'm going to repeat the process with the second set. So remember, I'm just wetting kind of a V shape, and if you need to wet it a little bit once it's on the flower, that's fine too. So I'm just covering one of the seams with this first petal, and I'm going to just repeat the process. Now notice that this is at almost the same level as the other flowers. So I'm just going to adhere that one side, and then tuck the second petal in. I'm going to leave that open. And then the third petal inside the second. So as you can see, it kind of looks almost somewhat like a pinwheel. And then I'm going to close them off. If they seem like they don't want to stick, or your water has dried, just add a little bit of water to it. It should be fine. Or you can add a little bit to the petal too. And then I'm just smoothing it downwards. I'm getting rid of the excess. So the third set of 3 will be put on a little bit differently. It's not going to be wrapped up here as much as the others, because I want it to start to look like it's opening up from the bud. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm still going to wet them at the bottom here. But I'm just placing it, I'm going to place it on a seam where it's going to cover one of the petals. And I'm going to do the same to the next seam. And then what I want to do is I just want to adhere it to the bottom. So it's starting to open up. Okay, so you can kind of give it a little bit of life to it. I don't know, like curl them over a little bit. I usually just curl them once they're on the rose. Just play with them. Now, see how these two barely touch each other. That's when you know that you need to start moving to more petals on here. So that's when you need to start moving to 5 or 4. I just try to stay with odd numbers because the rose is so built up that these petals are going to start to have a bunch of space in between them. So that's how I know, okay, it's time to move to 5. Okay, so 5 petals. And as I'm softening the petals on my pad, you notice I'm leaving pretty much the bottom part thicker. And I'm just thinning out this part because you want to have this bottom part thick so that it stands up and it has stability. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, ideally you would have each one covering a seam. However, that's not necessarily possible because you're not putting 3, you're putting 5. So I offset a bit of each petal. And my petal is pretty level with the top. So I'm just leaving it right there, and it's fine. It's not really going anywhere. And then I'm going to add the second. And at one point, one of the petals will cover a seam. And then I'm going to cover the last one of the seam, and then that should cover the first of the 5. And I'm just going to go around, just kind of adhering. And then I'm going to start to smooth out the bottom a little bit. And then I'm just going to kind of start opening them a bit. And you might find that your petals, the edge might be a little dry. That's fine. And then they might be kind of cracking or whatever. That's part of, you know, the beauty of a rose. They're not perfect. And certainly that's what makes them beautiful. So just, play with them. You want them open. You want to start seeing some space in there. This is rather still kind of closed. And what I'm going to show you now with the second set of 5 is how to really get the rose to look like it's opened. And that's partially because they're somewhat dried. Okay, so this is where I'm going to introduce the drying cup. And I use the drying cup for many things. This is really great. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of flip the petals a little bit, just the edge to kind of open them or make them seem like they're just peeling off the rose. And I'm just going to set them in this cup here. Now I usually put them in here for about 5 minutes or so. I usually have another set I'm working on that's been drying for a little bit while these are still drying, so I multitask a lot. If I've got a lot of roses to make, that's what I'll do. But this actually makes them hold their shape so that they're curved out and they're not so floppy. And then that kind of gives you an open look of the rose. Hi everyone, so we're going to continue with the final 5 on our rose. So these have been sitting in the drying cups for about 8 minutes or so, 5 to 8 minutes. And just going to wet the bottoms. So you just want to wet from the tip to halfway. Okay, so as you can see, they have kept their shape. They're still flexible, but they're a little bit more stiff than the petals prior. So I'm just gonna go and place them a little bit below this round here of petals. And I'm tucking them inside of each other. And a lot of times what I'll do is I'll actually turn it upside down so I can see it better. And I'll tuck one underneath each other. So here you have 5 petals, kind of in a spiral, and I'm just going to open them up a bit. If you find that they want to fall, just press them a little bit. Like this one wants to open up a little bit more than I would like it to. So I'm just going to press it a little bit, but also what I do is I hang these upside down just to let the petals rest upside down. That way they're not wanting to flop all over. Okay, I would rest them or have this hanging upside down for about maybe 10 minutes, and that should really help. Now at this point, if you want to go bigger, you would go up to the next size. So this is what we were using. So this is 23 of all of these, 23 of this cutter here. So you would graduate to the next size up and you would do 5. The reason being is because it's a little bit bigger, it's going to still cover up your seams. You'd necessarily have that happening if you used another 5. Your seams would start to barely touch, and you would find that you have open spaces in between each petal. If you graduate to the next cutter, you won't necessarily have that problem. Once you graduate to the next cutter, you would do 5, and then if you want it larger, then you could graduate to 7. So you have to kind of gauge your rose size with your petal cutter size. This third one, you could do a large rose. But keep in mind, that's a lot of petals for that small little bud. So say the bud was this size, that's a lot of petals on one little bud. So what you could do is make, if you know you're gonna want a larger rose, you would make a larger bud. Say the size of something like this, and you would just use a larger set of petals, and that bud would be able to hold up all those petals as well. So, and it would be a lot easier on you, where it wouldn't pop off the wire or anything like that. So, and the same goes for a smaller rose. If you wanted an itty bitty tiny rose, you would just make a smaller bud and just go with a smaller petal size. So now we're going to make the calyx. And this calyx cutter is a PME calyx cutter. I believe it comes in 2 in a set. And I'm just going to kind of stretch this out a bit. You don't really need to soften the edges in your bag unless you want to. I just soften them using my ball tool and flower pad. And then you just wet the petals of this. And turn it upside down and just gently press. And you can have some sticking out, some adhering. Okay, so then that would be the bottom. And it's really nice because it does cover up kind of, you know, anything that is kind of unsightly or you don't want anyone to see. And it completes the look. So there it is, pink, nice little rose. As you can see, my petals are still very soft and I can kind of manipulate them as I want. And it looks like the rose is about to open. Okay, and there you have it. Thank you for watching.